All right, so the first big story we're going to cover is the big settlement that just happened between the IRS and Treasury Department and Trump, the Trump organization, and his sons regarding the leaks of tax documents in 2019 and 2020. So, a small history lesson to what has taken place in 2015, whenever Trump was originally running for president during his first campaign. He famously refused to release his tax documents, his tax returns, or anything like that, like had become tradition for other presidential candidates for years prior. Some could argue it was a more symbolic gesture to the public of good faith, but regardless of what it meant practically, he refused to do it, and that caused obviously a lot of rampant speculation about why he wouldn't want to release it. And I think he was asked in numerous interviews and gave a bunch of different kind of warbly answers. But ultimately, he didn't end up releasing it. And to the extent it potentially hurt his electoral chances, it clearly didn't hurt them enough because he was obviously elected president for his first term in 2016. Well, 2019, an IRS contractor by the name of Charles Littlejohn was one of the handful of people in the IRS or connected to the IRS that had access to these documents. And decided to leak them to the New York Times. And it was not only tax returns, but it was just sort of a treasure trove, a collection of different kinds of tax documents related to Trump, his sons, and the Trump organization. The New York Times analyzed these for a while, went them through their lawyers, yada, yada. And they eventually, in September 2020, a little less than a year later, or maybe around a year later, I'm not sure, released their big op-ed on these documents. Some big revelations from these documents were that Trump only paid $750 in federal income taxes in the years of 2016 and 2017, respectively. He did this using a number of business type loopholes, arguing that, I think along the lines of his businesses took losses in those years. So I can't remember the exact reasoning, but that he only paid $750 in federal income taxes in each of those years, respectively, which is obviously way, way less than a billionaire should be paying, and way, way less than the average voter who's making $40,000, $50,000 a year would be paying in federal income taxes. They're obviously going to be paying more than him. It also revealed what a lot of people suspected was the case, but that he had a number of ongoing legal disputes with the IRS. Regarding and lawsuits regarding previous tax filings, unpaid taxes, certain kinds of debts he held with them and private entities and whatnot. In October of 2023, this Charles Littlejohn guy was pled guilty to leaking these tax documents. He not only pled guilty, but he admitted the whole thing, explained exactly how he did it, and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for it. People, for the most part, I guess, assumed that was kind of the end of the story on that. But it wasn't. In January of 2026, after Trump was already clearly president of the United States for over a year, he decided, him, the Trump organization, and his sons decided to sue the IRS and the Treasury Department for these leaks. And the reason they gave was reputational damage, business damage, and undue burden or undue damages or whatever, things like that. Now, one small side note is that if you're going to argue reputational damage because of these leaks, you'd think if the documentation was fine and kosher, that there wouldn't be any reputational damage just from it being leaked, right? This seems like more of an indictment on the tax documents themselves rather than the fact that they were leaked. You'd think if they were fine and they were leaked, there wouldn't really be much of an effect on his reputation, but put that aside for a second. This lawsuit was put in place in January 2026. And there was speculation for months about how they're going to handle this, right? Is the IRS going to settle, IRS and Treasury Department going to settle with President Trump to pay him money, right? And when you settle a civil lawsuit like this, you just pay them money directly so the lawsuit can be dismissed and taken care of. This is obviously a tremendous conflict of interest because the IRS and the Treasury Department, whenever they are sued in this regard, are represented legally by the Department of Justice, right? By their lawyers and stuff. Well, the head of the Department of Justice, the guy who controls everything about the Department of Justice, is directly appointed by the head executive, which is the president. So you see where the problem is, right? If President Trump as an individual is suing these agencies, the IRS and the Treasury Department, and they're being overseen by the very people that he appoints, right? It's a perfect circle, right? It is the most obvious case of corruption and conflict of interest that you could possibly come up with, right? Because he could just tell the Department of Justice guy, look, appoint some lawyer and tell them to do whatever, settle with me and do, under my terms and do whatever I want, regardless of what the law says, or I'll just replace you. And so people were speculating for quite a long time that he's just going to settle, and he's going to use the IRS and Treasury Department to pay himself personally, and some weird boondoggle, this clearly corrupt operation. Instead of taking a direct payment, though, they just came to a settlement, like a week ago or a few days ago. And there's two major parts to the settlement. Okay, instead of being paid directly, like some lump sum amount of money like you would in a typical civil lawsuit settlement, what they're trying to do is establish an anti-government weaponization fund to the tune of $1.776 billion, 1776. Haha, they think they're so clever. And this fund is basically created so that anybody who feels they've been the victim of government legal victimization or targeting or lawfare — I hate that word, but that's the verbiage they use — lawfare or whatever, can apply to this fund and potentially be paid restitution directly out of this $1.776 billion fund for legal costs, for emotional damages, whatever they deem is correct for. I believe that they wanted to set this up as a commissioned panel of 5 members, of which all of whom would be directly appointed by President Trump. This is super weird, and it might end up holding legally. This is the one part of the two parts of the settlement that I think might end up actually holding legally, because if the DOJ, IRS, and Treasury Department have the ability to settle civil lawsuits just in general, if they could have decided to pay him $5 billion to settle the $10 billion lawsuit instead of going to court or whatever, then I would think that maybe they have the ability to, instead of doing a direct settlement, basically settle and then reallocate this money in this kind of way. So this might end up holding. The second part of the settlement that's super weird and never really been seen before, and I have a feeling likely will not hold up legally in some regard, will be the immunity that him, his sons, and the Trump organization have been given regarding audits, ongoing IRS civil disputes, and future legal tax-related litigation regarding any tax filings or years prior to the settlement. So any years prior to 2026, if they engaged in any sort of tax avoidance, tax dodging, whether it was by conduct or by accident, it's basically saying that the IRS cannot go through and audit them. They cannot go through and sue them or try and seek restitution for this, or even really investigate them at all regarding any of this. And it also brushed away. It also dismissed any ongoing litigation or lawsuits or audits or whatever of those 3 entities of Trump, the Trump organization, and his sons, regarding tax returns, other tax documentation, and things like that. This is obviously super, super weird, because it's just like this weird blanket immunity that they're giving him. I just imagined for 5.5 seconds that it was Obama or Hillary Clinton or somebody like this that gets some sort of deal like this, right? The Republicans would lose their goddamn minds. They'd be screaming from the rooftops, "Oh, what's Obama trying to hide? What's Hillary trying to hide by getting getting a sweetheart immunity deal from the Justice Department or from the IRS or whatever, right? Let's release the tax documents." Like there's no way that this would fly on the Democratic side, all right? I wonder if they did this in an attempt because maybe they were planning on doing a traditional cash lump sum settlement of like $5 billion or however many billions of dollars or whatever, but instead thought that looked bad, so they went this sort of weird 2-part settlement route. But this, I think, looks just as bad, if not even worse, because now we can't even investigate what they did or potentially did in previous tax years. It's just sort of this black hole that they're also legally immune, and it says forever that they're not allowed, they can't be investigated or prosecuted on any of these things in prior years moving forward. It doesn't apply to years after this. So for years 2027 and onwards, if they mess up in their tax records or whatever, then the IRS can audit them and engage in all these things. But it's basically saying any years prior to that, moving forward, they're not allowed to be audited, prosecuted, sued, things like that. I have a feeling that this part of the settlement is not going to hold for whatever reason. This weird blanket immunity seems super messed up, clearly corrupt, and also even if it somehow did hold through this administration, through this term, if a Democrat was elected in 2028, I don't really see what would prevent them from basically making this null and void and saying, no, that was illegal. The IRS can now go engage in audits or resume these lawsuits that they were pursuing against Trump, the Trump organization, and his sons prior to this weird settlement, this weird immunity given to them because overall it's illegal and yada yada. They're saying that this fund can be used to pay anybody, not just not just conservatives or whatever, but anybody who feels they've been weaponized or been engaged against in lawfare by the government. But there's no freaking way that they're going to pay any liberals or any Democrats any money for anything they apply for regarding this, right? This is only going to be used to put money in the pockets of those he felt helped get him elected and his friends and stuff like that. Lawyers representing a group of hundreds of January 6 rioters are already saying that they're going to apply for millions of dollars in restitution. Even though they were pardoned, they're still going to try and get paid for all this. So not only are they going to get pardoned for the January 6 riot, which is super, super, obviously super wacky and messed up, but they could potentially get paid millions of dollars for it. It was insanity. Enrico Tarrio, who was famously the head of the Proud Boys, who started some militant group that was going to help try and stop the certification of the 2020 election from Joe Biden winning over Trump, and was sentenced to 22 years in prison and was pardoned alongside with all those January 6 rioters. He only ended up serving 3 years. Saying he's going to seek up to $10 million from this fund. Just imagine Enrico Tarrio getting paid for this, right? He already got pardoned for it. A couple of Trump associates that were investigated during the 2016 Mueller Russia collusion Steele dossier type investigation, who are arguing that not because they were prosecuted, not because they had to pay any fines or serve any time, but just the fact that they were investigated at all is lawfare, is government weaponization, and they should be paid restitution for it, which is friggin' super wacky. I cannot imagine this is going to be used in any good faith manner. If this ends up holding up legally and they start paying off these January 6 rioters or some of his associates who were involved in Russia collusion, which I'm pretty sure they did prove that there was some illegal collaboration in 2015 and 2016 trying to get dirt on Hillary Clinton because she was obviously running against him in 2016. I'm pretty sure there was some smoke there. It wasn't just all noise and nonsense, but they're going to try and get paid for it. And if the commission is made up by 5 people that are appointed by President Trump or Republicans, it doesn't matter if there's any truth to it or not. They can just give them money. They can just throw money at them and say, you get $10 million because you were persecuted because the government investigated you a bit. That's crazy. That standard would never be held for anybody. And just imagine for 5.5 seconds any of this happened to one of the Democrats, to Obama, to Biden, to Hillary Clinton, right? Republicans would be losing their freaking minds. They would never let this stand. It would just be World War III. And so, yeah, we'll see where this ends up legally. I have a feeling that the weird immunity that they're being given over future lawsuits regarding prior year tax documents is not going to hold, but this anti-government weaponization settlement part of the fund part of the settlement might end up holding. We'll see. I think one of the funniest outcomes of this might be them trying to pay Mike Lindell, because he's always talking about lawfare and how he's persecuted and all that stuff, right? But he's a wacky dude, and he had that whole contest he ran where he tried to offer $1 million or $10 million or something like that to somebody who could prove that the election was in fact stolen or wasn't stolen or something like that. There's so many different ways that this could go. There's so many bad faith ways that this could be used, and so it'll be interesting to see where this ends up.